Hey guys, in this episode I'm going to show you every trick I've got for improving foliage performance. Let's get to it. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode, and today we're doing something a little bit different because we're going to start out the episode by painting foliage really densely across our landscape, basically getting our FPS really low, committing every rookie mistake in the book when it comes to foliage. And then we're going to spend the rest of the episode going through every trick I know to improve the performance of that foliage without sacrificing the quality, really the look and feel of the game. And after we improve the performance quite a bit, we're going to get to the point where there's still some aesthetic issues in our foliage, and I'll just go through those, the common ones that I see, and how to fix those. So here are the key concepts today. So FPS, if you watched our previous video, you're already familiar with that. That's really the key benchmark indicator that tells us how well our game is holding up. Cull distance is the distance at which certain assets like foliage will start to disappear across our landscape. And when I say disappear, I mean disappear, but if we design it correctly, the player won't even notice it disappearing. And the reason it needs to disappear is so that the game doesn't have to process those foliage assets. And we're also going to get into the intricacies of what makes an asset particularly poorly performing or well performing based on the triangles and vertices. If you've ever heard a polygon count, this is what I mean by triangles. So basically, it's the number of polygons, the number of parts of the mesh. In this case, in Unreal Engine, it's measured in triangles of our asset. And Unreal Engine assets automatically come with what's called levels of detail. So each of those assets has the highest level of detail when you get up really close, the maximum number of polygons, the maximum number of triangles. But when you zoom out, those assets automatically scale back to a lower level of detail where not as many triangles need to be processed by the game. And the last level of detail is called the Billboard Material, which is really a 2D material that really should only be shown very far away from that asset. And we'll go through all of these settings. You know what, guys? I'm really excited for this episode. It's so rare that I get to deliberately mess stuff up, and that's exactly what we're going to do to start. And I suppose my computer is really going to hate me by the middle of this episode, but that's okay. It's an inanimate object. It doesn't have feelings, so we're going to plow on through. All right, let's get to it. So in our last episode, we went over how to paint foliage in our earth quadrant here, both the rocks and the plant life that you see there. And the other thing we started to cover was FPS, which I can activate in the top left corner of my screen here. And we can see here we have a pretty good FPS. Most games aim for maybe 60 FPS if they're really fast action, maybe 45 at a minimum. And so right now we're looking pretty good. But we're going to drop this considerably over the next few minutes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to paint the outer edges of our earth quadrant here. And if you've been following along last episode, we started a spreadsheet where basically we're setting all the assets that we're using every one of these episodes in that spreadsheet. And you could see the latest iteration of the spreadsheet down below. You could download those assets and just bring them into your world from QuixelBridge. And what we're using to paint the outer edge of our earth quadrant here is this red fountain grass asset. So I just sorted that under my 3D plants, under my earth quadrant folder, under water edge, red fountain grass. And plants, they already come with foliage assets. So if I go into the foliage folder, I'll see them here. And basically my purpose with this red fountain grass is to line the entire river with it. So it's not really possible for the player to see into the quadrant that far. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use these three, kind of the denser assets. And so the first thing I want you to do is navigate over to our foliage mode. And for everything that's a 0, so everything that you downloaded already this episode, if it has foliage assets, it's going to come into our foliage mode automatically. But what you can do is you can select the top one, just like our last episode, and come down to the last one that's a 0 and just remove all of those assets. And do the same thing for our next batch. So everything from here down to the bottom. And you can right click and just say remove. And that way we're just starting with the assets that we've already painted. And then you can come over to your content drawer and select the first one, hold shift, and drag those three in for the red fountain grass. All right, so now we can see them below. And last episode we went over how to paint these. So you just select all three, and we have our brush size and our paint density. And for these, I'm going to make them a little bit bigger. I'm going to make them, let's say, 2 to 3. And the other thing we want to do is, because these are going to be painted at an angle, at a pretty steep angle, we actually need to go into those assets and adjust the angle at which they can be painted. So if we navigate back to the foliage assets and just go into each one, so that's this ground slope angle here, because otherwise if we paint on the side, it's not actually going to paint because the angle is too steep. So let's move that up to something like a max of 75 degrees. And we have to do that for all 3 assets. All right, now let's up our paint density to full, so we just paint them densely across the edge. And as we do this, let's watch our FPS there. So now our FPS went from about 80 down to, let's say, 65, maybe 70. Yeah, something like that. So we're well on our way, but let's keep this going. So now we're going to paint our water quadrant. So for our water quadrant, what I'm envisioning is basically a dense jungle. So I'm thinking of something like Jurassic Park or The Lost World, the second movie, where I remember a scene where they're all trying to escape through this plain with like really high grass and they can't really see much in front of them. And you got the velociraptors that are slowly approaching them. I'm envisioning that kind of environment for this quadrant of our garden because it'll be particularly fun for playtesting combat and things like that. So to start, I want you to come up to the very first asset on the left-hand side here, the Rika Palm, and select that, and come down all the way to the last one that's a 0 here. Hold Shift, click, and then select all of those. And then we're going to do the same thing for the ones below. So if we come down here, select our first rubber bush, and hold Shift, click, select all of those as well. So now we are ready to paint. But before we paint, something important. If I keep this paint density at 1.0, it's going to be so dense, it might even crash my computer. I don't want to do that. And the reason it'll be so dense is because it's a 1.0 paint density for every single one of these assets. And we just selected something like 50 to 100 assets. So really it's a density of about 100. And just for the sake of the demonstration here, I'm going to lower it to about 0.1. But this too is also way too high, because really we have about 100 assets. That's a paint density of 10. But I just want to show you what kind of effect this has on FPS. So we got about 2,000 assets of each times 100 assets. It's about 200,000 assets. Let's go back to select mode, play, try it out. All right, so we're looking at 40 FPS, dipping down into the 30s, dipping down. You know, I expected it to be worse, to be honest. But that's still pretty bad, right? Because keep in mind, we're still missing 2 out of our 4 quadrants we haven't painted. We don't have any spells or effects. There's a whole lot of stuff we still got to add into our game, and our FPS has to be a lot higher than this. So, how can we increase our FPS? The first thing I'll mention is that I don't actually like the look of the scene as it is, because the player can kind of see over the trees, over the foliage here. And so to start, I'm actually going to increase the size of these. And this is kind of an obvious trick, but it's also a really good one for increasing your density without increasing the total number of assets, simply making the assets larger. So let's come back out, and let's go into foliage. And I'm just going to go ahead and erase all this. I'll change our brush size to something larger so it's easier to erase. All right, so now we can select all of our assets here. And let's up our scale quite a bit. So let's up it something like 1.5 to 2.0. And I'll come down here as well, and I'll do the same for these down here, 1.5 to 2.0. We're keeping them uniform. Now go back over to paint mode, and because we up the size of these, we got to decrease the density. And because we up the size by 100%, it's actually more than that because it's in 2 directions. It's the X and the Y. And so we could decrease the density quite a bit. I would say if we go down to something like 0.02, that's going to be roughly equivalent. So let's give this a go. All right, so look at our FPS now. So we're already above the 30s that we were before. So now we're up to about 45. If I look at our character here, our foliage is still really dense, right? Like I can barely see through things. And I can see my character just barely. But in some ways, I think this could even be less dense, but I like it. It's a good start. And the foliage is high enough that I can't really see that well through the jungle. But I'm just going to decrease our density down to about 0.015. So let me go ahead and erase all this, and we'll paint one more time, because I think it could still be a little bit less dense and still have the effect I'm looking for. We're just at about 50, goes up to 55, comes down to about 48, But I like that density. I can see my character quite a bit, but it's still very dense. Yeah, in general, we're looking pretty good. But really, this FPS is still a problem, right? Because if we're already at 50 FPS and we still haven't painted 2 quadrants of our garden, we don't have any special effects, we don't have any other characters in the scene whatsoever, that's not sustainable. So we got to get this up considerably higher. So where do we start? So the very first thing that we're going to do that focuses entirely on improving performance for our foliage is something called cull distance. And I think the best way to show you this is via our biggest asset here. So these really tall Areca palms. And so if you come into the content drawer and if you go into our Areca palm folder under water quadrant main palette, and I'm going to go into the foliage assets there. And it's really this really tall one that we're talking about. So there's a setting in here called cull distance, the minimum and the maximum. And what this is the minimum distance that our asset begins to disappear, basically not be rendered by our scene, and then the maximum distance that it disappears. So culling basically means that. It means that particular asset is no longer rendered by the game. And that's the distance from the camera when that gets set. So let me just give you a quick example of really bad cull distance. So if I set this to something like 2000, and then I hit play, so I can see our palms just fine, and then when I back up, oh, it just disappeared. And so one common mistake with cull distances is setting them too short. But also you can have the opposite problem, which is you set the cull distance too long, because the cull distance should vary considerably depending on the type of foliage asset they are talking about. So if it's a foliage asset that's really tall, like that Areca palm, it's going to be seen from very far away. You want to set that cull distance to really high, if at all, because it could be seen from all the way across the map. Whereas if it's something that's really short, that asset's not going to be seen that far. But the other important factor in setting the cull distance is really how dense is the area in which that foliage is placed. Because in our jungle in this case, I can't even see more than, let's say, 5 meters in front of me, especially if I'm in the interior. And this is exactly why we have separate foliage types for our water edge. Because for those foliage types, I'm going to set them to either not cull at all or cull at a really far distance away, like something like 20,000, which would be equivalent to 200 meters. And then because we have the foliage blocking on the edges of our quadrant, we can actually cull the stuff that's on the interior without having that visibly be noticeable to the player. So let's go into those foliage assets and begin setting those cull distances. The first thing I'm going to do is correct that Areca palm. That's probably the only asset here that I don't want to set a cull distance for, simply because it's so tall, it kind of sticks up above the rest of our jungle. So I can set that back to 0 to never cull. And that's okay if you've got 1 or 2 assets that are set to never cull like that. That's totally fine when it's important. The important thing is that the vast majority of our assets are culled at a certain point, so that the performance impact doesn't happen across the map. So for the rest of these Areca palms, because they're kind of taller assets, I'm going to set that distance to be quite far. And usually I give the minimum and maximum a little bit of difference, so like 8,000 to 10,000. And what that does is it kind of gradually fades out that asset over that distance. And then for something that's much smaller, like this arrowhead plant here, if I go into those foliage assets, because those only come up to maybe waist level, chest level at best, really I don't need to set that any higher than say like 3,000. Now this could vary depending on the density of your foliage. It's one of the upsides to having a really dense foliage jungle like I have in my scene, because we don't have to set those cull distances to be very high. But usually it's still less of a performance hit to actually thin out your foliage if you have that option in your scene. It's just for the jungle effect that I'm going for, we need to have very dense foliage. So in those cases, the cull distance becomes especially important. Now this is going to take a lot of time, both for the assets in our water quadrant and also our earth quadrant with our Nordic ground cover here. But it's worth it, and I want you to take a look at the FPS as it stands now. It's about 50 to 55, and we're going to see if we can get that up above 60 with just this one trick. For our Nordic coastal ground cover here, I would set the really tall assets to something like maybe 5,000 to 7,000, but for our short assets like these white flowers here, they're never going to be seen past the rocks, right? So we could set a very short cull distance there, maybe like 3,000 to 5,000, and we'll be just fine. The last exception to this is our water edge foliage for our earth quadrant. So if you come into the earth quadrant folder, water edge, and go into this red fountain grass, just these foliage types here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set these to about 20,000, which means you got to be really across the map in order for them to cull. And the reason is I could be looking downriver, and I want to make sure that when I'm looking downriver, even quite a ways, that I would still see that red fountain grass from far away. Alright, so I've now finished setting cull distances for pretty much all of my foliage assets in both the earth quadrant and the water quadrant. And for our shorter assets, I ended up setting these to about 3,000 to 4,000. For these mid-range, it's about 5,000 to 6,000. And some of the larger assets in our water quadrant, I set as high as 8,000 to 10,000, but pretty much all in that range. And I can see my FPS now is, well, looks like about 60, but let's go ahead and play and let's see where we're at. And there's really two things I'm testing here. So one is testing to see, is there any foliage that I can actually see appearing or disappearing? And for this, it's helpful to zoom out basically as far as you want your player to be able to zoom out. And don't worry so much about the foliage changing, the flickering that you're seeing there. That's actually another problem. That's more aesthetic in nature, which we're going to cover a little bit later in this episode. It's mostly the foliage disappearing, and I cannot see, as it currently stands, anything disappearing. And my frame rate's up about, looks like about 6 or 7 FPS, a little bit above 60. But let's see what we can do to actually boost this even further. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is what are called LODs, levels of detail. And if you go into one of your static mesh assets under the water quadrant main palette, and to start, I recommend going into this arrowhead plan, because this is a good example of something that's not a very high density asset. So if I select any one of these meshes, and if I zoom in all the way into that asset, so in the top left corner you see the current LOD, so it's LOD 0, and you see the number of triangles and the number of vertices. And this is basically the polygon count of how many parts there are to that mesh. But what's neat about Unreal Engine assets is that as you zoom out, you'll notice that that changes to LOD 1, or triangles are about 2/3 of what they were, and I zoom out a little bit more, and now it's LOD 2, and the triangles are even less and less and less and less. And then when I get to a certain distance, the mesh fundamentally transforms and looks totally different. And that's the final LOD, and there you see the triangles and the vertices. And what's happening with that transition is that every step of the way, Unreal Engine is calculating a different size of the asset. So it's basically resizing the number of triangles, the number of vertices of that same asset. But at the final level of detail, it switches over to something called the Billboard Material. And the Billboard Material is basically a 2D image, a flat image of the asset. And because of that, if the Billboard Material is switched to too close, so if the asset is too large in the screen when that switch happens, it's very evident when that occurs. And that's exactly what we were seeing when I was kind of zooming around our level here. So if I zoom slowly backwards, you see all these assets changing. They're not disappearing, they're not being culled, but they're switching over to that Billboard Material. And when that happens, it's really evident. But let's go back to that arrowhead plant now. And I wanted to start with this because this is an example of an asset that's not particularly dense. So it has 1,500 triangles, 1,300 vertices, which is pretty dense, pretty high quality, but it's not going to break our PC. And I want to contrast that with another asset that's in our water quadrant. So if I go back to main palette, this spineless yucca, this one's a killer. So let's go into that, pick any one of these assets. I'll just pick the very first one here. And I zoom in all the way to LOD 0. So look at that. So this one, we're looking at 26,000 triangles. So this foliage asset, it's roughly 15 to 20 times as performance intensive as that arrowhead plant. And now if this asset was 15 times the size, that would make sense, right? Because then we'd want to be able to get up close and see that level of detail. But it's not in this case. At most, the spineless yucca is probably about twice the size. And then if I zoom out, I could see LOD 1, I could see LOD 2, and then it's starting to get into more normalized levels of triangles and vertices. So what do we do about this? Because honestly, I really like this spineless yucca. I like these plants. They're pretty awesome. Well, there's two things that I recommend in this situation. So the first thing that we can do is if you come over on the right-hand side, there's actually a setting of upping the minimum LOD. So we saw that LOD 0, that's the maximum number of triangles. And if I change the minimum LOD here to 1, then you see our triangles are down to roughly 1/3 of what they were. Now this does have a quality cost, right? Because now the spineless yucca plant isn't nearly as detailed as it was before. And so let's go back to 0 just for a moment. So when you do this, what I recommend is getting really close to the asset, just about where I am now, and then make the change. And as you make the change, just watch it and see if you notice a significant decrease in the quality. So when I switch that to 1, honestly, I can't tell. I saw it move a little bit, but looking at it right now, to me, it looks almost as dense as it was before. So whenever I up the minimum LOD, if I can't really tell the quality change, then we're good. Then I know we're all set. And that cut out roughly 2/3 of my triangles and vertices. So let me go ahead and do this with all of our spineless yucca, and then we'll test our performance again. All right, so I did that, but our performance hasn't really changed that much. It's still hovering there around 60. So the other thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to scale back the total number of spineless yucca assets because I really like these, but I don't think there need to be quite as many in the scene, and they are the densest asset. So if I go back into foliage mode, and what I'm going to do is just make sure I've unselected everything. So I can check everything, uncheck everything. And specifically, I'm going to select our spineless yucca plants, so this through here, and select all of those. And it's hovering right now around 390 to 400, something around that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change our erase density to 0.01, set our brush size to 1000. And what this should do is get rid of about half the assets. So I want these numbers roughly around 190 to 200. So let's give this a go. So that culled it roughly 3/4, right? So I'm just curious, let's see if that has an impact. Yeah, so that actually made a huge dent. Just that one thing alone upped our FPS by somewhere between 8 to 10, which is huge, right? So I still see some of those spineless yucca assets. Not as many, but that's totally fine. You know, the look and feel of what I have in this jungle, it's basically the same. And so I got the same experience for our player for 10 FPS, which quite frankly is an awesome trade-off. And there are some other assets in this group, like some of the ferns, that are also pretty dense. So if you want to try this trick out for some other things too, go right ahead. Now another thing that I'm noticing is a very similar situation to the yucca with the red fountain grass here. And these are really dense, really high poly assets. So if I get in close, you can see just how dense those are. And I can see on the edges of my earth quadrant here, my FPS is really dipping down. So at some points it's hitting 55. Yeah, because I have a lot of those high poly assets very close to each other. So I'm going to take a slightly different strategy here. What I'm going to do, if I go back into foliage mode, once again, I'm going to unselect everything. And then I'm going to come up to our red fountain grass, select those. And you see we have about 800 of them that we're rendering. And actually, I'm going to start by erasing all of them. If I go back to play mode, so I can see my frame rate here is much higher without them. So that's definitely the issue. And the reason it's the issue is because they are so dense. So if we go back to our 3D plants, then our earth quadrant, and our water edge, red fountain grass, if you go into the largest one here, so we see at LOD 0, we have the same kind of thing, about 34,000 triangles. This is a really dense asset. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the minimum LOD to 1 and see what kind of effect that has. So let's look at the quality as I set it. Very subtle shift. But I did actually notice it, and if a player gets really close, I want this to look good. So let's go back to a minimum LOD of 0. So instead of that strategy, we're going to do something else. So now I'm going to navigate back to foliage mode, and if I scroll back down to the red fountain grass, so the strategy that I'm going to take here is a little bit different. So instead of changing the LODs, I'm just going to up the scale of these, because we're going to keep them very dense, but just change their size so they do a better job covering the edge of the quadrant. And because I'm upping the size so much, what I'm hoping is that I can change the paint density to be something much lower and still get the same effect. So let's change it to something like 0.25. And I'm also going to make my brush size much smaller. Yeah, so this ain't bad, right? So we've got it almost covering the entirety, and we're only at 180. So let's see if we can up that just slightly, and we'll paint in the areas that are specifically missing an asset. I realize this is kind of tedious, guys, but sometimes it's what you got to do to get the best effect. So let's go back to select mode. We'll hit play. Yeah, so that's pretty good. We're barely dipping below 60 now, even in our worst spots, right? So I think that's about as good as we're going to get. And I can't really see through that, especially if I go to the other side of our river. Yeah, I can't really see to the other side. So that just about concludes our work on foliage performance this episode, but hopefully that gives you a really good place to start. But I think for all intents and purposes, getting it to the level where we're at now, which is about 60 to 65, it's pretty solid. But now let's make a final pivot for this episode, and let's take care of the most common aesthetic issues that you'll see with foliage. And a couple of them we've seen already, right? Because you see our areca palms, for example, as we get further away, they're transforming, and they're doing so pretty obviously. And that's that billboard material that I mentioned earlier. So let's go back to our content drawer, and let's go to our 3D plants, and this time we'll go back to our water quadrant, main palette, and go into the areca palm folder. And so every foliage asset comes with our main material and then this billboard material. And what's happening is each of these meshes is switching from the main material over to our billboard material, but they're doing it too close to our camera. And so because of that, it's very obvious when the switch occurs. So let's go into our first asset here. So if you scroll down on the right-hand side in the details panel, you could see the total number of LODs for our Areca palm is 4. And we could take a look at what each of those 4 LODs are doing by selecting this custom check mark. And you see our LOD1 that's using the standard material, and so is LOD2. But when we get down to LOD3, this is our final LOD, it's actually using a different material. This is the billboard material that I was talking about. And what's controlling the transition from one of these LODs to the next is how large that asset is on the screen. And that's defined by the screen size here. And so the reason that that billboard transition is so obvious is because the screen size is actually still pretty large when that transition occurs. So if I scroll out just a little bit, and then boom, you see it actually occur there. So it's not that small on the screen when the transition occurs. But if we change this to a much lower value, and let's say I'm going to set it to 0.05, about 1/4 the size, then I have to go much further out before that transition occurs. And at that point, it's so far out that I can't even notice it occurring. So I'm going to save this, and we're going to go into each of the Areca palm assets, and I'll set that transition. The really critical one is this super tall one here, 0.05. And now let's take a look. So let's look at our very tall assets. We zoom out. Yeah, so I barely noticed the transition, right? And so now I'm going to set this same setting in a number of my other assets here. So for example, these large ferns, if I zoom out, yep, they suddenly transform. So the culprit are these tropical palms. I'm just going to come up to custom again, come down to LOD4, 0.05 for the billboard. And so really the right way to test this is to be running through our water quadrant and see if we notice anything changing as we're running through. And you could zoom out a little bit just to see it. And I'm still seeing some assets transform as I run through the jungle here. So we're going to need to figure out what those are and set lower thresholds for our transition to our billboard material. The next ones are these Chinese fan palms. For these, because they're a little bit shorter, I can set them to slightly higher, about 0.07. The next ones are these Janet Craig Dracenias. For the shorter ones, I can set this to something like 0.07, but for the taller ones, I want to set it to 0.05. The next ones are these Silver Lady Ferns. I'm going to set these to about 0.09 because they're a little bit smaller. So now as I'm running through my jungle here, there's some very subtle changes. I think there are a few additional assets might benefit from changing those distances, but in general, it's looking pretty solid. But there's one additional one here, which is our Earth Quadrant Water Edge. If you notice way in the distance, I can see it switching, and it just gets a lot darker when it switches. So let me show you how we can fix that when it does switch so that it's not quite as dark a contrast. So if we navigate back to 3D Plants, and this is our Earth Quadrant Water Edge Red Fountain Grass. And the reason that we notice a darkness change is because it's switching from this texture here, this base color, to this one. And you notice that it is darker. So let's see if we can lighten this a little bit. So I can change our brightness curve to 0.8 and our RGB curve to the same, and that should lighten it. And now out there way in the distance, when it switches to the billboard material, it's basically the same color, so I don't even notice. Alright, so the last thing we have to do is we have to paint the edges of our water quadrant. And for that, we're going to use some new foliage. So back in 3D Plants, our water quadrant and our water edge, we have 2 for this. And my vision for this is we're going to have bamboo all along the edge, kind of blocking the interior. And then around the lake with the 2 corners specifically, kind of envisioning them like fangs, we're going to have these snake plants. But the first thing we've got to do is we've got to clear our foliage from the edges. So I've selected everything under foliage mode. I've set our erase density to 0. I got to make sure I'm in erase mode. And then I'm going to carefully run it along the exterior of our water quadrant. Alright, now I can uncheck all of these, and we're going to come back down to our content drawer. We'll start with our Lucky Bamboo in the foliage folder, and I can select all of these and I'll drag them in. And since all these are sorted alphabetically, I can just scroll up to them. You'll see them with zeros there. And then I can check them off. But remember, before we paint, we have to go into each asset and we have to make sure that the max angle for ground slope is high enough that it's going to get the edges of our quadrant. And then I'm going to come down to our scale. I'm going to set the bamboo to be about 3 to 4 times its regular size. So now I guess we're ready to paint, right? But there's actually a couple issues still with this bamboo that you're going to see when I paint. Alright, so what's looking not quite right with this bamboo? Well, the first thing I'll note is that it's a lot darker than the rest of our assets, right? And so you might have foliage that you want to use in a scene, and it just isn't the right color compared to the rest of what you want to use. And we already went over how to do that with the billboard material of our red fountain grass here. So if you go to our content drawer, and if you go to our textures that are for our bamboo, I'm going to start with the main one here, and we can lighten this considerably. 0.7, 0.7, save, and there we go. Now it's looking much closer to the rest of our foliage. But if I zoom out, you see it switching to the billboard material, and wow, that's crazy dark, right? So let's go back and do the same thing for our billboard material. 0.7, 0.7. And our billboard material still looks a little bit darker when it transitions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back to our main material, and I'll just make that a little darker to compensate. So I'll go back to 0.8 there. Yeah, so now the transition isn't nearly as stark. But there's one more issue here, and this one is less obvious, right? So does bamboo grow to the side like it does there? I haven't seen bamboo grow that way. Typically it's straight up, right? So what's the setting that's controlling our bamboo growing that way, diagonally? So the first thing is I'm going to erase our bamboo that we already painted. And then the setting we need to change is down here, align to normal. Because the normal is the slope of our landscape, right? So if we uncheck that, then it's just going to paint straight up. Now we still want it to vary a little bit, right? Like maybe about 3 degrees in any given direction. So I can set our random pitch angle to be, let's say 3. So now let's go back to paint mode and let's give this a go one more time. So now we're talking. That looks a lot more realistic, right? All right, so let's finish painting our bamboo across our water quadrant. And you know, if some assets stick over the edge, really don't think it's a big deal. You know, this jungle is intended to look pretty chaotic. That's kind of the motif I'm going for. Now let's go back to our snake plants. Drag those in. And we can come down to those, select those. And we're also going to make the scale for these a little bit larger. So I'll set the scale to about 1.5 to 2.2. And make sure you uncheck our bamboo above. So I'll select the top, select the bottom, uncheck. Snake plants selected. Here we go. Are those kind of cool looking? I really like them actually. They're a little dark though, so let's adjust that. I'm just going to set the billboard material to transition a little bit further away for the bamboo, and then I think we're done. 0.07 should cut it. And for our snake plants, even smaller. Let's do 0.03. And there's not too many painted in the scene, so the performance impact of doing this shouldn't be that significant. So let's do one final FPS and quality test. See where we're at. So some of the changes to the billboard material actually decreased our performance because then the billboard material switch isn't occurring until we're further away, which means the game is rendering more assets with the main material. So I could attempt to boost our FPS a little bit more by thinning this out a bit, but I think I'm going to wait because there's going to be decorative elements, things that we're already doing that are going to thin out our quadrant. And you're going to see that in subsequent episodes. The very last thing we got to set up is our foliage wind. And we won't do that for every asset, but let me just show you for the Areca palms because they're the biggest, the tallest. So if we jump into the material here, and we can select Enable Grass Wind, check that checkbox. And to start, I'm just going to check the wind height because we're definitely going to need to change that. And I just made this in a small window so that we can take a look and see how it's affecting our foliage in real time. So just like our last episode, we're going to adjust the wind height based on the height of the foliage. So I'm going to adjust this to maybe 2, a little bit higher, 3. But we also have to change the intensity, so let's try that out. So let's lower that to 0.05. Yeah, that's looking good. And maybe I can even increase the speed. Let's see what happens if I do that. Yeah, that doesn't look too real. Let's go back to 0.5. That's looking pretty good. Let's see what happens if I increase our height even further. And I can lower our intensity even more. Yeah, I like that. That's really then being reflected in the leaves rather than the stem. That's looking pretty realistic. So that's the importance of adjusting the wind height and wind intensity based on the size of the asset. So I encourage you to experiment with this. And if you come up with any really good wind settings, I'd be curious to know what they are. So post a comment below. And one really quick note, if your wind isn't working right away when you enable it, just restart the engine and it should be working at that point. There's one last glitch in our foliage assets that you might see from time to time that I wanted to go over how to fix. And that's this issue that you'll see with one of these Nordic ground cover assets. So take a look at the really tall ones. When I zoom out a little bit, and I zoom out, and I zoom out, and I zoom out, and disappear, gone. And this is actually not a cull distance issue. This is actually related to the LODs not being built correctly on this particular asset. So if you see that happening, that's exactly what we're going to fix. So if you go back in your 3D plants, into your Earth quadrant, main palette, Nordic coastal ground cover, the asset with the issue is this var1, if you double click on that. So right now we're at LOD 0, but if I zoom out, suddenly it shrinks down to roughly half the size. And I'm not sure what the cause of this is, but I do know how to fix it. In order to fix this, you have to set the number of LODs all the way down to 1, apply changes, and then basically you need to rebuild the LODs. So we can come right back to that same setting and set number of LODs 7, apply changes, and make sure that this checkbox for auto compute LOD distances is checked. And when you do that, it basically erases the old LODs and then it's recomputing with new ones, and you see it computing properly as I zoom out. So now let's save this and we'll try it out. So if I zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, zoom out, yeah, it's not disappearing. They're sticking around. So it's still going to be governed by the cull distance settings that we set up, but basically it fixes that LOD issue. So this episode, we did a whole lot on both foliage performance, but also aesthetics. So I wanted to wrap everything up with 2 slides that you can take away and use as a reference. So in summary, these are the techniques for improving foliage performance, and these are our techniques for improving foliage aesthetics. So that concludes our episode for today. I know it wasn't the most fun, but I hope you got some really good ideas for improving both the performance and the aesthetics of your foliage. And in our next episode, we're doing something a little bit more artistic. We're going to be working out of a brand new mode called the modeling mode, and we're going to download a bridge from, ironically, Quixel Bridge. And then using the modeling mode, we're going to take that bridge apart into several pieces. I'm going to show you how we can give each piece its own material to give it that stylized look that you see here. And the last thing we're going to do next episode is we're actually going to sculpt and then paint our pathways using these pebbles here. So I hope to see you there.